The chairman quits. Sharp falls on his sword to protect the BBC's reputation, but questions remain about the mysterious £800,000 loan and the independence of the BBC. Richard Sharp says that the independent report into his appointment found only that he inadvertently broke the rules after he failed to disclose a potential perceived conflict of interest in his dealings with Boris Johnson during the recruitment process. Tonight we ask the former BBC political editor Andrew Marr and the former Conservative Culture Minister Ed Vaizey if the appointments process has to change. Also tonight, an update on last night's exclusive of an NHS GP not allowed onto British evacuation flights from Sudan. After a swift government U-turn, he'll be on his way home very soon.
So I'm supposed to be back tomorrow, so my actual flight was tomorrow, and first day working is on Tuesday. All my hospital know about it.
And this.
Somebody mentioned to go onto Google and go into the news section and then type in "died suddenly."
This film, Died Suddenly, claims that many sudden deaths are actually caused by the COVID vaccine. Now those mourning the loss of loved ones are being targeted on digital platforms by the film's online supporters. What does the film's producer think?
I gave this platform to God, okay? I'm on a very specific mission, and that is to expose lies that are killing people.
Good evening. A potential perceived conflict of interest. That's how the barrister Adam Heppenstall KC described the problem. The chairman and the board are the protectors of the BBC's independence. We now know Mr Johnson's number 10 intervened on multiple occasions in favour of Mr Sharp's candidacy, and that a senior official eventually told the then PM to stop asking Mr Sharp for financial advice. Mr Sharp acknowledged he should have been more open with the recruitment panel and MPs about his involvement with Boris Johnson, and that he could have continued in his job but did not want to be a distraction to the BBC. Mr Sharp appeared to fall foul of that unwritten rule: don't become the story. Unable to appear publicly amidst the tumult over Gary Lineker, substantial questions remain, however, about the BBC's independence as a different Prime Minister appoints another BBC chair, and about this mysterious loan to the former Prime Minister. Ben Chew is here. Does it shed any further light, this report, on some of the substance here?
Well, let's keep in mind that really important underlying issue of that £800,000 loan to a serving Prime Minister. Peter Riddell, who is the former Public Appointments Commissioner, said that is one of the big unanswered questions of this affair. So does the Heppenstall report shed any light on it? Well, not directly, but it does include some interesting and potentially important new information. First, though, let's look at what Richard Sharp said when he was still chair of the BBC in an internal email on the 23rd of January this year. He says that I introduced an old friend of mine, Sam Blythe, to the Cabinet Secretary. That's Simon Case. Now, remember that Sam Blythe is the person who reportedly wanted to guarantee a loan to Boris Johnson to help with his financial problems. But let's look at what the Heppenstall report today has said. He writes, I note that I've been told the introduction to the Cabinet Secretary never happened, in the sense that the Cabinet Secretary never met nor was in contact with the person, Sam Blythe. Now, they can't obviously both be right. Either there was an introduction or there wasn't. So why is this important? Well, we were led to believe that the loan that Mr Johnson ultimately received was fully declared and that the Cabinet Secretary had been fully across it as well. So if the Cabinet Secretary never met with Mr Blythe, then who guaranteed it? Was it perhaps someone else? And most important, arguably, of all, where was this money, the loan, actually from? We just have no idea. Now, the Heppenstall report was not asked to look specifically at ministerial ethics, but it did make a pointed reference to the ministerial code today and the statement that ministers must avoid placing themselves under any obligation to people that might try inappropriately to influence them.
And have we heard anything from those involved that you just talked about?
Well, the Cabinet Office told us that it's not for officials to register or approve loans. It's for ministers to declare them in line with the ministerial code. As for Mr Sharp, I'm told that his view was that this was an effective introduction because in that meeting, Mr Case asked for and received Mr Blythe's phone number, and he was left under the impression that they were going to meet. As for Boris Johnson and Sam Blythe, we haven't heard anything.
OK, well, thanks very much for that update, Ben. And so we will now go to Seema Kotecha, who's been looking at the day's events.
For an organisation committed over the years to political impartiality, the appointment of its chairman is anything but. Someone they like and trust, given the role to uphold and protect the BBC's independence. And as history shows, political patronage has often played a part. Conservative Prime Ministers have tended to pick Conservative chairmen, while Labour Prime Ministers have often chosen Labour chairmen. When Labour's Harold Wilson became Prime Minister in 1964, there was no ambiguity as to what he thought of the BBC, dominated by Tories and damaging to his own party. A few years later, he appointed Lord Hill as chairman to, quote, sort out the corporation. In Margaret Thatcher's days, she appointed Marmaduke Hussey to deal with what she thought was left-wing bias. Labour accused her of appointing someone who was on her side. There are more examples of how this relationship has been one of influence. It's not unusual that somebody is given a job because they have things in common with their employer. They may have similar ideas and thoughts.
But the BBC is supposed to be beyond all that, with impartiality at the top of the Director General's priority list. When the political trouble arrives, and it inevitably will, having a chair who can bat for the BBC without suspicion of having an ulterior motive is key.
A former BBC boss believes the appointment process needs reform.
There used to be a system, and the system was that the chair would come from the governing party and the deputy chair would come from the opposition party. So there was a time when Marmaduke Hussey, as a Conservative supporter, was chairman. And I think at that point, Michael Cox, the deputy chairman, was a former Labour chief whip. So you had an overt system in which the politics were declared. I think what's happened in recent years is that you do still have political appointments, but they've been overlaid by this veneer of an independent appointment panel, which you'd have thought would have just come up with the best candidate, whereas actually there's clearly, as the report today shows, a meshing between what the politicians want and what the independent panel wants, and that's really what led to the debacle over Richard Sharp.
The National Union of Journalists has been campaigning for a change in the rules.
I think this whole fiasco that's led to the eventual resignation of Richard Sharp shows that there needs to be a process that's carried out with transparency, with integrity and with real, genuine public scrutiny. So that's what the NUJ would like to see, a new independent process that's free of political taint and interference.
But supporters of the system have told us it's not broken and that it doesn't need fixing after one man's mistake. One person who didn't want to go on camera said many of these political appointees end up being far from critics of the organisation. Indeed, lifting the lid on the inner workings of the corporation turns them into stout supporters of the BBC and its independence. Perhaps the system, they argue, should be left well alone.
The BBC's first Director General, Lord Reith, put impartiality front and centre of the BBC's mission. Will the government now want the next chairman to embody that Reithian value?
Well, let's pick up some of those issues raised by Seema Kotecha. Joining me in the studio is the veteran former BBC presenter and former political editor Andrew Marr, now of LBC Radio and the New Statesman. And down the line, Lord Ed Vaizey, former Conservative MP and Culture Minister. Andrew, welcome back into the building, of course.
Feels very familiar.
The Shadow Culture Secretary says untold damage has been done to the BBC's reputation from this. Is this really the case?
Not untold damage, but some damage. I think Richard Sharp should have gone before. And I think the real problem is that he was so close to Boris Johnson at a time when the Johnson administration seemed to be, as it were, going to destroy or push back lots of the traditional guardrails in our very complicated, balanced constitution. and there was a strong sense that he was after the BBC, wanted to really squeeze it. And out there at the moment, there is a perception among a lot of people that the BBC is a kind of right-wing, pro-Brexit organisation controlled by the Tory party. And then there's even more people who think that it's a kind of left-wing, muesli-munching, open-toe sandaled bunch of Brexit-hating liberal lefties.
Is that anything new?
No, there's nothing new in that, except that what's happened is the country has become much more divided, and the BBC is less highly regarded than it used to be. You've got two groups of people, for their own reasons, really going for the BBC, and therefore anything that gives those one side the perception, the idea the BBC is indeed somehow biased or controlled from outside is very, very dangerous for the BBC. And I candidly think that Richard Sharp's chairmanship made life harder for BBC reporters.
OK, Ed Vaizey, let's bring you in. Andrew Marr there suggesting that in the middle of a culture war, it's been quite difficult for the BBC, and this has played into that.
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think Richard Sharp was a great chairman of the BBC, and if you look at the statement put out by the BBC, it's quite a heartfelt farewell to Richard Sharp. It wasn't a bland corporate statement, and I think on any measure, in terms of Richard Sharp's CV, he was perfectly qualified to be the chair of the BBC. He had a distinguished career in business, but he also had a lot of public policy experience. He'd been chairman of the Royal Academy. He'd worked with the Institute of Cancer Research. He helped with the film and television bailout during COVID. So he was a good chair of the BBC, and I don't think his appointment damaged the BBC. And in fact, what Seema Kotecha said earlier in her report, the person who said that people who get these appointments tend to end up backing the institution, I think is actually absolutely right. We tie ourselves up in knots about political appointments. What you often find is that the minute those people are appointed, they become great champions of the institution they chair, and I think Richard Sharp did that.
But Lord Vaizey, I mean, clearly there was a period of some tumult over the past 3 months, the Gary Lineker episode, where he just wasn't able to be present.
Yeah, exactly. And Richard Sharp has resigned, and he's resigned. I think he was right to wait for the report. I don't agree with Andrew that he should have gone earlier. It was right to wait for an objective report which said what he did right or what he did wrong. But it was also clear that I think his decision to resign was a reflection of the fact that the difficulties he was in were a distraction for the BBC. And I think the Lineker episode did show that. It was hard. I think I'm told that Richard Sharp did a lot of work behind the scenes. That's what people have told me. But it was hard for him to go out in public and defend the BBC because he was working under a cloud, and that's just the facts of life.
Exactly.
If Richard Sharp had been fired immediately, which is what you suggest he should have been, then that would have been an interference in the independence of the BBC, would it not?
He shouldn't have been fired. I didn't say he should be fired. I said he should have gone. He should have resigned. He was in trouble with the Select Committee, you remember.
Yes.
And, you know, quite mainstream Conservative MPs didn't like what they were hearing from him and thought there were big inconsistencies. And it was at that point that I thought he should go. You know, I accept that he is, you know, a thoroughly, frankly, a sharp man. You know, he's got a lot of experience, and I'm sure he loves the BBC and was doing his level utmost to help the BBC. But we are in a new era now when direct connections with prime ministers, particularly that prime minister, is a problem. You know, we talk about the previous ones from Seema Kotecha's report, but there was always this culture of restraint.
Really?
Holding...
Well, let me ask you directly. I mean, obviously, you were famously our political editor here at the BBC at a time when Gavin Davis was chair and vice chair, friends with Gordon Brown. His wife was in that unit.
Yes.
Why is this anything different? And was it not the unspoken privilege of an incumbent prime minister that they get to pick this role?
Two things about Gavin Davis. First of all, he resigned his membership of the Labour Party as soon as he was appointed. And by the way, Chris Patten, when he was appointed as a Conservative, stood as a crossbencher.
Richard Sharp said, I leave my politics at the door as soon as I arrived.
They both made very specific decisions. But you're absolutely right. I was there with Gavin Davis, and then went through the whole Hutton report and all the post-Iraq stuff with him and Greg Dyke. And any sense that they were somehow in bed with the government of the day, with Tony Blair, is exactly the reverse of the truth. If you remember, they both had to resign. Gavin Davis first and then Greg Dyke.
So it was completely different in the 2000s?
They were taking on the government of the day. I mean, Marmaduke Hussey is the most interesting example of all, because he was very close to Margaret Thatcher, and he got rid of the then Director General Alistair Milne very, very quickly.
Ed Vaizey, one of the interesting facts here was that the opposition seemed to really go for Richard Sharp, which was a choice that they made. You know, Keir Starmer raising it at PMQs, for example. Do you think that was a factor in the perceptions that this could play out politically?
I'm sure it was a factor, and if I was in opposition, I would have gone for it in the same way. That's what oppositions do, and you can make political mileage out of an unfortunate situation like that. But I fail to see what Andrew's case is here. I don't for a minute believe that Richard Sharp was a different chair to someone like Gavin Davies. I think when he became chair of the BBC, he was loyal to the BBC and wanted to do the best for the organisation. Okay. Of course, there's a debate about whether this should be, in any sense, a political appointment, which goes into
what
all
do you
sorts
think?
of...
Does this not draw a line under that?
Well, I think for us, I'd say a number of things. First of all, I think if you give money to a political party, that shouldn't stop you having a public appointment. And secondly, I do think that people who get these jobs take them seriously. And, you know, there hasn't been a kind of dodgy dossier moment with the BBC under Richard Sharp's chairmanship, but I've no doubt at all where he's still the chairman and there was a clash with the government of the day, the Tory government of the day, he would have defended the BBC to the hilt. I've no doubt about that at all. So,
but if you're advising Rishi Sunak right now about the new chair, would you say avoid a donor, go for some, you know, former Bank of England economist seems to be quite a popular point to reach for in the past, you know, someone quite
I think,
bland.
I mean, again, it's interesting what Andrew was saying, because I think a lot of this is based around the personality of Boris Johnson. We have a very different Prime Minister here, and we have a very grown-up government. And I don't think Rishi Sunak is in the business of handing jobs to the boys or girls. I think he wants to appoint the right person for the job. So I don't think he'll follow the same path. I think he'll try and appoint somebody who is a credible and excellent candidate. And he won't be too fussed about their political links or whatever. In fact, he's got quite a business-like mentality. So he's almost certainly going to try and get someone from the world of business to do this job. And I hope he breaks the mould as well, because we've had white male chairs of the BBC ad infinitum. So I hope he breaks the mould there as well.
So two different questions. I mean, who would you like to see do this job? And then who do you think Prime Minister Sunak sort of points towards?
Well, I personally would like to see, you know, a really big, experienced proponent of public service broadcasting who would, you know, remoralise and lead the BBC in a new way. And I mean, he will not thank me for saying so, but somebody like David Dimbleby is who I would like to see. But in terms of Rishi Sunak's choice, this is really, really interesting across politics, because it's a very, very difficult choice for Rishi Sunak, and we will learn a lot more about him depending on what he does. You know, does he go for the culture war? Does he go for squeeze the BBC? Does he give you guys somebody like Nadine Dorries or someone similar like that? Or does he go for, Ed Vaizey was suggesting he would, I sincerely hope he's right, go for somebody more mainstream, something more consensual, and, as it were, try and put these things back a little bit to the way they were before. I very much hope it's the latter. There's a whole series of, you know, conservative-leaning, well-known people in public life who he might choose. But I hope he goes for somebody like that.
And Ed Vaizey, your instinct is that that is what the Prime Minister will do?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, Andrew's just made a very good point, which is...
So sorry.
I think there will be something. There will be something in... I think it's a really thoughtful and interesting point, that this is a test for Rishi Sunak. Yeah. The Rishi Sunak that I think is the Prime Minister now would make a sensible appointment that's best for the BBC. And I really hope he doesn't make a kind of political culture war appointment. It'd be a disaster if he did that.
On such consensus, we must leave it. Thank you very much, Ed Vaizey and Andrew Marr, for joining us here in the studio. Now, last night we reported that NHS doctor Abdul Rahman Babakir was refused a place on a British evacuation flight from Sudan. Joe Inwood, who highlighted this story, joins me now to give us an update on the story. Joe, what is the latest?
Well, I spoke to Dr Babakir this morning, and he decided after the huge publicity around his story that he would have another go at trying to get to the airport. Of course, we've seen thousands of people trying to make this very perilous journey to an airport north of Khartoum, and much to his surprise, he told me over the phone this morning that he had made it. They'd allowed him through. Now, of course, the controversy here was about doctors of Sudanese origin, but working for the NHS, being denied access to these flights, these rescue flights out the country. I spoke to him. He was in a far better mood than he was the day before. He was very cheerful, and he told me about his feelings of going back to working in the NHS.
So I'm supposed to be back tomorrow. So my actual flight was tomorrow, and first day working is on Tuesday. All my hospital know about it. It's being posted in my hospital group, so many people know about it.
How do you feel about the idea of going back to work? Are you looking forward to it?
I'm not sure if I will. I'm ready to work, to be honest, at the moment, with all the situation in here, putting my family back at risk.
Well, that's great news that that's happened, but I mean, what about the general policy here?
The honest truth is, this is pretty unclear. Yesterday we spoke to the Foreign Office and they told us that the rules were that if you weren't either a British passport holder or a dependent of a British passport holder, then you could come to the UK, but you could make your own way there, which of course is impossibly difficult to do, or very difficult to do in this situation. Now, of course, Dr. Babakir's situation suggests that there had been a changing of the rules. Now, I've been trying to get hold of the Foreign Office and get a response all day. And in the last half hour or so, they sent me another email that said essentially the same as they said yesterday. But that's slightly at odds with what has happened here. And also at odds with the fact that we've heard of 2 other NHS doctors who have been allowed through in the same way. Now, this seems slightly contradictory, but actually the truth is that we were told there is discretion in the rules. And it is possible that what they're doing, especially following this publicity, is applying a bit more of that discretion. Now, there's one final thing, a bit of information from the government about this. Oliver Dowden, the new Deputy Prime Minister, said that he had been in talks with the Sudanese Doctors Association. Now, we don't quite know what that means, but certainly the indication we're getting here is that there has been some movement, and it's clearly been good news for Dr. Babakir, who we don't know exactly where he is now. I've tried to call him. His phone is off, and we suspect he may be in the air, but we won't find out for a few hours.
Thanks you very much indeed, Joe, for that. Now, it's more than 2 years since COVID vaccines were first rolled out. Throughout that time, conspiracy theories have swirled, claiming that the jabs have killed large numbers of people. Now, a viral film has taken off, supercharging this theory and creating a new online trend of tracking down stories of individual tragedies and linking them without any evidence to COVID vaccines. In a rare interview, the film's creator told the BBC he was happy to hear about the harassment of bereaved families it had incited, saying, "All we're doing is saving more lives." And exclusive research shared with BBC Newsnight has revealed how Twitter's new policies might have played a role in the film spread. Rachel Schreier has this report.
The vaccine killed your spouse. It's all your fault. You murdered, it's all these things, but it all goes back to that vaccine. And the key words were died suddenly.
Late last year, Trisha's husband came home from a day's work as a maintenance man in their housing complex, collapsed on the carpet and died of a sudden and unexpected heart attack.
I'd known him since 7th grade. Our life went separate ways, but we met back up just as we were both going through divorces in 2015, and we got married in 2021, and then he died a year, 4 months later.
It was an everyday tragedy. A man in his 40s with high blood pressure and a pre-existing health condition. He'd lost 2 brothers in quick succession just months earlier. Trisha thinks the stress of it affected his health. But when Trisha shared the news of her husband's death online, looking for some support, in amongst words of condolence, she began to receive a flood of more sinister messages.
Apparently the combination of the words died suddenly coincided with some movie that was coming out about that time, and that's what maybe triggered some of it, and got so many of them to constantly, the vaccine killed your husband, the vaccine killed your spouse.
Somebody mentioned to go onto Google and go into the news section and then type in died suddenly.
The film, called Died Suddenly, claims baselessly that people are suddenly dropping dead in large numbers, and COVID vaccines are to blame. Now any sudden death announced on social media, no matter the cause, can be used as evidence for this conspiracy theory.
When you see people attacking your healthcare decisions and how you take care of your family in your own home, and telling you that that's responsible for killing your spouse while you already feel like crap because you didn't recognize the signs of a heart attack. It puts you down some dark holes after a while, it does.
The belief that swathes of people are being killed by COVID vaccines has become a significant one within the anti-vaccine community. It's driving mistrust in public health advice. But in this case, it's also driving a mistrust so deep, it even extends to doubting what bereaved people are saying about their own loved one's death.
And then you find out they were vaccinated. Something's causing this. Somebody needs to look into it.
The film's creator, Stu Peters, has built up hundreds of thousands of followers and millions of views across different platforms. I wanted to speak to him online. When I joined the call, it became apparent he'd rented a warehouse especially for the occasion and had brought his own crew to film the interview in order to get his own distorted message out. Several of the clips that you show are from people passing out before COVID vaccines were available. Many of them did not die. Did you include them by mistake, or were you deliberately trying to mislead?
So here we go. Okay, so this is an attempt to try to discredit me or the film, rather than talking about the millions of people that are dying.
But if millions of people are dying, why didn't you use them as examples? Keontae Johnson collapsed in December 2020 before the vaccines were available. He's still alive and well. He played in the National College Basketball Championship this year. Why did you include him in the film?
We released a film that has saved millions and millions of lives. You know that, I know that. You've been sent here to discredit it. You'll have to take that up with God. Look, I gave this platform to God, okay? I'm on a very specific mission, and that is to expose lies that are killing people.
I put several other errors to him. The headline actually about a man who died in a car crash in 2017. The American football player Damar Hamlin, who collapsed after colliding with a fellow player. And when I ask him if he's sorry for the harassment of people like Trisha his film is inciting, he showed no remorse.
As that begins to trend and as that continues to grow, all we're doing is saving more lives. I think that's awesome.
But Stu Peters doesn't seem to want to answer any of my direct questions about the film's message, which is miles away from the weight of scientific evidence.
There is no evidence whatsoever that vaccines have been associated with any increase in mortality.
The Died Suddenly film has been far-reaching. But exclusive research for the BBC has found evidence of coordinated and inauthentic activity by accounts sharing the link and the hashtag, which seems to have helped it go viral. Previously, content like this might have been removed from Twitter under its old COVID misinformation policies. Now, the site seems to have played a significant role in helping this film and the associated misinformation and harassment take off. I asked Twitter about this, but they didn't respond to my questions. For Trisha, though, the problem is much more profound.
People are going out looking for what they already believe. They're looking for that confirmation of their own biases. They are not looking for actual facts, actual truth. They don't want to know.
Rachel Schreier there. So we do have some time to have a look at tomorrow morning's front pages. Let's have a look at The Guardian. BBC chair quits as row over Tory sleaze grows. The Guardian leads on there. Rishi Sunak under pressure to stop appointing Conservatives to key positions at the BBC, it says. Moving on to The Times, which doesn't go on this story, but does go on the NHS strike posing a threat to Great Ormond Street, the Children's Hospital. Serious concerns over staffing levels there, and of course looks ahead to next week's coronation. And then the Daily Telegraph, there is a reference to the story of the BBC chair, Gary Lineker's tweet saying, "Don't let ministers pick the BBC chief." Lineker said in a tweet, "The BBC chairman should not be selected by the government of the day, not now, not ever," which is what we were discussing. But another story there about surgeons operating only once every fortnight. So a busy news week, and that's all from us tonight and for the week. Thank you very much for joining us. Mark Urban is here on Tuesday. Till then, have a great bank holiday weekend. Thanks. Good night.
Breaking news from around the world 24 hours a day. This is BBC News.
This conflict.
We did not fire the first shot. All the mediators were present. We agreed to sit down at 10 a.m. and sign the final agreement. We were taken by surprise when we found that the country was shut down and all the bridges were under siege. They started to fire on us. At the moment, we are fighting to defend ourselves. We don't shoot our own people. This army is our army. They are our brothers. We should not fight with them. But since Al-Burhan is not trustworthy and is a traitor, this war destroys Sudan.
Joining me now to discuss the conflict is diplomacy and national security